Hello, welcome to the sixth episode of the Reti Nimzo Larsen Speedrun series. In this episode, we're playing against players in the rating range of 1100 to 1200 on chess.com in the rapid rating pool. And for this particular set of games, we are going to be seeing players who allow us to trade off our central pawn, trade off one of their central pawns for one of our non-central pawns. We're going to see some c4 taking on d5, messing up the opponent's center. We're going to see also a couple of games where our opponent really tries hard to build a big center of their own. A couple of players play a move like queen to d6. They try to play e5. They try to gain space. But we also talk about how to play against these types of setups that our opponent might go for, how to work against them, make sure that they're not able to get that center created easily, and we're going to be able to break it down at the right time or be able to prevent it from occurring and being built in the first place. So that's the couple of games that we'll be taking a look at. I do also want to say that you might notice a bit of a different scenery for this particular video compared to the previous ones. I did actually have a situation that occurred. There were a couple of tornadoes that happened in the area that I live, and so our power at our house was knocked out for about a week. So I'm recording from visiting some family members instead. So that's the difference with the background. You might also hear a little bit of echoing on the mic or a little bit of different noise kind of concerns. Those will all be kind of fixed when I get back home and the power's been restored. But right now, I'm just kind of having to bear with the different location. But we'll be back to we'll get back home, get back to the regular setup as soon as the power is put back on at our house. So, anyways, though, enjoy the three games, and I will see you in these couple of games here. All right, so we've got our first game here of this episode. We're playing against T-Sand, rated 1149. They start off with knight c6 after our knight f3 move here. And so in response to knight c6, we are going to be going for the move pawn to d4. The pawn to d4 move is one that we've seen in one of the earlier episodes. Generally speaking, once again, when our opponent has the potential idea to play the move pawn to e5, we are playing the move pawn to d4 in order to discourage them from putting their central pawn up on the e5 square. If we had continued with our normal b3 move, black would play e5, d5, and they would get two pawns in the center of the board, which we'd rather not let them have for free. So d4 prevents the move e5. Black responds with the move d5 themselves. And so now we've reached essentially we've reached a d4, d5 type of opening, except our opponent has put their knight on c6, which is usually not a great location for the knight to be on in these types of positions. The downside of the knight on c6 is that it blocks the c7 pawn, and usually the c7 pawn is pretty useful for either moving up the board to attack the central d4 pawn, or for moving up the board to protect the central d5 pawn. In this case, it can do really neither one of those things. So if they can't move their c pawn, I'm going to go ahead and move my c pawn. We've turned the position into what's known as a Chigorin defense. And so our opponent plays the move bishop to g4. They are not protecting the d5 pawn with a friendly pawn of their own. And so for that reason, we are going to go ahead and make this exchange of pawns. If black had played a move like pawn to e6, we would not necessarily be in a rush to trade these pawns. But because black is no longer they're not protecting the d5 pawn with a friendly pawn, we are going to make this capture on d5 here. Black will either need to recapture with their queen right away. Another option for black was to play the move bishop takes f3 first before recapturing. But it doesn't necessarily change a ton. I will say that bishop takes g4 is kind of the better move in the position, because the real drawback to taking back with the queen immediately is that we're able to play the move knight to c3 right away, attacking the opponent's queen on the d5 square. And if black had instead played the move bishop takes f3 first, and then we recapture with one of our pawns, then they would be able to take the pawn on d5, and we wouldn't be able to play knight to c3 just yet, because they would be able to take the pawn on d4. In this case, though, they don't have the time to take the pawn on d4 because we still have the knight on the f3 square. So they retreat the queen, and what we can do in this position is we can actually just go ahead and advance our central pawns. This is one of the big advantages of trading off your opponent's central pawn and them not being able to replace it with a pawn, because now we have a pretty substantial space advantage in the center, and we can just push the pawn up to d5, attack the knight on c6, and we just gain more space, continue kicking our opponent around, and it's already a bit of a tough position for black to deal with here. The knight doesn't really have any great places to move to, at least not forward in this position. If they go knight to b4, we have the move queen to a4. If I can get my arrows correct, we have the move queen to a4 check, attacking the king, attacking the knight on b4. They end up retreating the knight back to the b8 square, and there's a couple of options we can consider in this position. We could go pawn to e4, just grabbing more space in the center. We can throw in the move knight to e5, attacking the bishop. Queen to a4 check isn't as good in this case because the bishop can come back and block the check, so I'm not necessarily in a rush to do that. Queen to b3 is also a reasonable move, attacking the b7 pawn. So I think what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to start with the move knight to e5, advancing the knight up the board, attacking the opponent's bishop on the g4 square. The bishop has to move somewhere, and then probably I'll follow up with queen to b3, putting pressure on the b pawn. That's probably the idea I'm going to be working towards here. So the bishop can go back to h5, f5. Okay, he decides to go back to the h5 square. Now the drawback of the bishop all the way on h5 is it's very far away from the queen side. And now when I play the move queen to b3, it's going to be kind of awkward for black to protect this pawn on b7 in any kind of meaningful way. Now, first things first, I want to make sure I don't play the move e4 right away to grab more space because my pawn is pinned. So I do want to get away from this pin to begin with. I am going to start with this move queen to b3. Queen to a4 check is also now a little bit more possible because the bishop can't come back and block the check. But black would still be able to block with their knight, and I don't think I'm really getting anything super special out of that. So I'm going to go for queen to b3, attacking the b pawn. Black will either play b6 or queen to c8. Those are the two moves that I can see to defend the threat. Now, the downside of them playing the move b6 in this position is that once they've played the move b6, it ends up that a lot of these light squares, specifically the c6 square, I would say, is a bit weaker. It's a bit weaker in this position for our opponent. What this means is that if I ever check on this diagonal with my queen, or maybe even with my bishop at some point, it's a lot harder for black to block the attack on the c6 square, because now there's no longer a pawn on b7 to help with that. So what I'm going to do is, I could check right away, but I think, again, the knight's going to block, and I don't know if I really see a great follow-up there. There are some interesting ideas here, I will say, about maybe like pushing this pawn forward in combination with the check and my knight moving out of the way. That's actually kind of an interesting possibility now that I'm recognizing that. But I'm going to play this one a little bit more simply, I'll say. I do have a feeling that queen to b5 check and then pawn to d6 could be a very interesting way of doing things. But I'm actually just going to play the move pawn to e4, gain more space in the center, open up the bishop on f1. My real threat now is to play bishop to b5 check. And if the bishop checks rather than the queen, black will not have the ability to block with the knight, because a bishop taking the knight is different than a queen taking the knight. So bishop b5 check is a big threat. Our opponent plays the move a6, trying to discourage that from happening. But that being said, I think we have a tactical opportunity in this position. Even though black has played the move pawn to a6 in order to discourage one of our pieces from going to the b5 square, there is still the square on a4 that's available. And so, for example, if I play queen a4 check, black is not able to block with their b pawn, because I can simply take the pawn with one of my pieces, and the pawn on a6 is pinned. If I can get these arrows right. The pawn on a6 is pinned to this rook on a8. So if they were to take my piece on b5 and my queen was already on a4, I could then take the rook on the a8 square. So if I check on a4, the knight is going to still have to block on d7, most likely. Sounds like there's a little bit of a storm brewing in the near future. But after knight to d7, what I can do here is I can trade the knights, and then play the move bishop to b5 anyways, because that once I trade the knights and the queen takes back on d7, then the rook on a8 will no longer be protected. And again, if they take my bishop with the pawn, then I will take the rook on a8. So I think here we have this check available. The knight's most likely going to block, is my assumption. Again, if the pawn blocks, I'll either take with the bishop or the knight. I'm not entirely sure if it makes a gigantic difference which one I use. Yeah, I think black's already in significant trouble here. We're going to be winning material in this position pretty quickly. And so a lot of this is really due in part to, first of all, the opening, the way that black played the opening. If they're going to play the Chigorin, Well, hold on. First of all, just I think I was planning on taking the knight and then playing the pin. I think we'll just go for that option. There might be other moves that are good here as well, but I'm going to go for this one for its simplicity. If the queen takes the bishop, I have the knight protecting it, and if the pawn takes the bishop, I take the rook on a8. And if they block with the pawn, I'll still take on c6. So we're going to win material here. We get the rook with check. Queen has to block. Now I can check on c6, force the queen to block once again. I can also trade queens and then take the pawn on b5. I think I'll check with the queen here first. Make the queen block, and then I'll take on b5. The difference here is I want to continue putting pressure on the c7 pawn, so I just recaptured the queen. Now knight takes pawn on c7 is a big threat. And if the king moves over to protect it, I'll just bring the bishop out to attack it another time. So as I was saying earlier, the main reason that black gets into trouble in this position, or in this, in this game here, is that the opening, the Chigorin opening, it's a playable opening, but you have to be very precise with how you do things, or you can land into trouble very, very quickly, as we saw in this game. When we go back through the opening, I'll kind of talk about the better options that black should have tried in the beginning of the game. But then another problem that black ran into, here I'm just going to go ahead and take the pawn in the center for free. Still hit the pawn on c7. Another one of the problems that black ran into is that they never really got their kingside pieces developed, as you can see. They've still, only now on the 18th move of the game is black developing their bishop. It is coming with the check. There's a number of moves that are good. I think I'm just going to move the king over. If I block with either one of these pieces, I lose my pressure on the c7 pawn. And I can't move the king to any of these light squares because of the bishop. So I'll just move the king over. My king's not in any kind of danger here whatsoever. Worst case scenario, I can always push one of these pawns and get the king off the back rank. But right now I'm threatening to take the g7 pawn, and I'm also threatening to take the c7 pawn. So yeah, here we'll take with check. King moves. Let's go ahead and I suppose we could just take another pawn. And the threat here now is to check and push the c pawn down the board, and yeah, it's a tough looking position for black here. I don't know if you could hear the thunder in the microphone, but I'm on a kind of traveling setup, as you can see if you've seen any of the other episodes, and yeah, I'm visiting some family, and hopefully this storm doesn't bother us too much in the video here. So black plays 97. They're attacking her pawn on c6. I could check, push the pawn, and stuff like that. However, the knight on e7 does protect the promotion square, so I don't think I'm really getting anything super special out of that. I think I'll just push the pawn, probably the simplest option here. And next I'll need to push the pawn, move the king up, get the rooks connected, and yeah, the main issue with my position, even though I'm ahead a lot of material, I'm up a full rook. I'm up the exchange and a couple pawns. The main issue, though, is that my rooks are not in the game just yet. So we'll see if I can get the rooks activated pretty quickly. And yeah, I think we're in pretty good shape at this point. Our opponent's having a tough time dealing with this passed pawn. Probably their best move is to play king to b7 to attack the bishop. And if they do that, I'll just retreat the bishop to safety, get the rooks in the game. I might even lose the c7 pawn. It's not the end of the world if that happens. But even if I lose the c7 pawn, I'm still going to be up a couple of pawns, up the exchange with a very good position. So black is thinking through what they're going to do here. We'll see what they decide to come up with. Probably black can also try ideas like bishop f7, maybe checking on c4 if I'm not careful. This would obviously be very bad for me to lose my knight to a fork. If black plays bishop f7, I'll probably play something like rook to c1 to cover the c4 square. I can also look to play a move like pawn to a3 pretty soon. Now that I'm looking at it, maybe pawn to a3 right here was actually an even better move. It kind of forces the bishop to a slightly awkward location. So maybe I could have ignored the threat on my pawn and played the move a3 a moment ago instead. Okay, black does play the move king to b7. I am going to retreat the bishop back to safety just to just to keep it safe. My pawn is still protected. And next I'll play the move a3 and go after this bishop on b4. Probably also play the move rook to c1 pretty soon as well, just to guard the c-pawn, maybe threaten to promote the pawn if given the chance at the right time. But yeah, definitely a tough position for our opponent. Again, the big issue I have right now is my king is stuck blocking my rook on h1. I really just need to play a move like f3, king f2, hit the rooks in the game. Once the rooks are in the game, then we're having a very substantial advantage at that point. Okay, let's go for a3. Let's attack the bishop. If the bishop moves away, there's also this idea of knight to d6 check, forking the king and the rook. Kind of just happens that they put the rook on a square that makes it forkable, you could kind of say here. And so, yeah, if black retreats the bishop to a5 as they're doing here I can check. I don't care about losing this pawn if I can get a rook in return. We take the rook with check. They can take back with their bishop, but then I'll probably just play the move pawn to b4 to attack their bishop here. And yeah, we're up the exchange. We're up. Well, I don't know if I guess we're ahead 2 exchanges. You could call it that way. Let's push the pawn to a4, get these guys side by side just to kind of create a bit of a barrier. And then we'll move the king, swing the rook over, look to advance the pawns. That is the game plan here. I'm not sure if it matters all that much which pawn I push first. I guess I'll push the b pawn. And then, again, move the king, swing the rooks in, and try to just push the a and b pawns down the board. So black has to move the knight somewhere. I would assume they play knight a5, trying to block up both of these pawns. I will then move the king. Okay, they go to b4. I don't know if that really changes a whole lot. I'll still just move the king over, swing the rook in pretty soon. I don't want to push the a pawn just yet because he'll take the b pawn, but maybe I'll move the rook over and attack the knight and then push the a and b pawns pretty quickly down the board here. Black could try some kind of knight to c2 move, poking my rook. I'd probably just play rook to b1 or rook to c1. Okay, they advance their g pawn. Not really anything I'm bothered by. Let's move the rook over. I'll move the rook over to the d1 square and try to invade to the d6 square. If I go to the c file, he's kind of got the c file squares covered pretty well. Whereas on the d file, I can maybe get to the d6 square, which is, maybe I'll pick up the f6 pawn, and then I'll push the e pawn down the board as well. So these a and b pawns may not be able to move forward that easily, though there is definitely the ability that I could have given a check and then swung the rook over and pinned the pawn, something like that. Okay, they play bishop g6, attacking my pawn. I'm just going to check and take the f6 pawn. I really just want to get the king off of the square where it's blockading things. I'm assuming the king will move to one of these 2 squares, probably c7. I'll take the pawn, they'll get my pawn, but then I'll start to push the b pawn down the board. Okay, they move the king forward. Okay, we'll just take this pawn here. And then probably just push the b and a pawns. That's the game plan. Let's go ahead and push. The pawn is protected by the rook. And then next I'll push this pawn, try to get them side by side once again. Push them both down the board. They give a check with their bishop. Let's go to the d2 square. This is 4 squares, or 4 moves. Well, how do I put it? It would take 4 moves for the knight to go from b4 to the d2 square, which means it would take 3 moves for the knight to check our king on d2. So you always want to be a bit careful about the kind of location you put your king when there's a knight on the board. You want to make sure it's kind of far away from potential forks if you can help it. Okay, they go back to hit my pawn and my rook. I'm going to just take the bishop. And if they take my rook, I'll just push the b pawn. I'm just trying to get pieces off of the board. I know here I am losing material by doing this. But it's going to be, again, very hard for black to stop the 2 pawns from promoting. Not a whole lot they can do to stop the pawns from just going down the board here. So again, as we've seen in some other episodes in other speedruns, it's generally a good idea to just, when you're ahead a ton of material, even if you have to lose a little bit of material to simplify the position, simplifying the position tends to remove really any of the tricks or traps that the opponent can go for. Here, if they take the pawn, I'm just going to promote on a8. We get the queen, and we will look to deliver a bit of a ladder type of checkmate. King goes up, check here, and then queen to c4 is going to be the checkmate. He has only one square available, and that is the checkmate there. Okay, so that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and go back through the opening and analyze it. So we start off with knight f3, of course. Our opponent goes for knight to c6. The reason we don't go for b3 here and go for kind of the autopilot on the Reti Nimzo Larsen is because black would get the chance to play e5. And if we go bishop to b2, they can play e4 and then d5. And black pretty much just has a space advantage without much of a fight. They could also just play like knight f6 first. They have more space in the center, and it's a position that we'd rather avoid if we can help it. Another option for black is to play a move like d6, and this is also relatively solid for them. Our bishop on b2 is a bit shut down by this pawn on e5. And so for that reason, instead of just autopiloting with b3, I recommend the move pawn to d4. We prevent black from playing e5, and we're also aiming to play the move pawn to d5, simply attacking the knight and kicking it around. We saw that that worked out later in the game, but black does stop it for the moment with their own pawn going to d5. And this is what's known as the Chigorin variation, or Chigorin opening. And the idea here is that you could essentially reach this same position after d4, d5, knight f3, knight c6. It's the exact same position. And it's kind of thought that the Chigorin variation it's not really a bad opening, but if black knows what they're doing, but it is an opening that a lot of players kind of stumble their way into without, you could say, purposefully going for it. And it's not a very good opening to play if you're not really familiar with what you should do in black shoes. So c4 is a good way of playing against this. The main issue, again, as I mentioned during the game with the Chigorin variation, is you are blocking your c pawn in a d4, d5 type of situation. We hit the center, black develops the bishop, we take the pawn. The best move for black here is definitely to take the knight on f3. They should capture this knight first. We would take back and double our pawns. Once black takes the pawn, they are attacking the pawn on d4, so we don't really have time to play the move knight c3 because they would take the pawn in the center. We would have to play a move like e3. And then the main way that black plays this type of position is they played the move e5, hitting the center. We hit the queen, they pin the knight, we break the pin, they eliminate the knight. And we get into this kind of interesting type of position here. I don't know if they play knight f6 or castle first. We get into this kind of interesting position where white does have the pair of bishops, but we have a slightly, not even really slight, we have a worse pawn structure. Isolated A and H pawns, doubled F pawns. So there's some good things for white, and there's also some bad things for white. It does tend to be the case that the advantages for white offset the disadvantages, I will say. So this is one of the reasons why this particular opening is not more common at higher level of play, because white does tend to have a pretty good position compared to black here. But it is a playable game nonetheless. That is the objectively better way for black to play the opening. So instead of doing that, though, black decided to take with the queen first. We kick the queen, we kick the knight, we kick the bishop. Just all of the moves we're making are coming with threats and attacks every step of the way. We attack the b pawn. And I think during the game, I think this queen b5 check might have been even better than playing e4. I think my thought was to check and then play a move like d6, opening up this potential attack. Maybe black has ways to defend this, but it would have been a bit tricky for them to figure out the best defense here. I think the best move might be knight f6 to guard the bishop. But anyways, though, I decided to go for e4, just looking to get the bishop in the game, looking to make this check on b5. And even though black played the move a6 to stop the check on b5, we still have a check from a different angle. And we were able to win material based on this pin. And once we were ahead the material, it was smooth sailing at this point. We're up a lot of material. Just look to take free stuff, get our pieces untangled, push the c pawn, and we eventually won the game. So that's it for this game, and I will see you in the next one. All right, so we're in our next game here. Let's go ahead and play the move knight f3. We're against Ehenny 98. rated 11-12 from the United States. So knight f3, they go for d5, which is one of the more solid options against our Reti Nimzo Larsen. So we're going to go for b3. They play knight f6, solid start to the game so far, bishop to b2. And let's see what black decides to do here. Bishop f5. Okay, so this opponent's playing pretty solidly so far. None of the, at least so far, they haven't played any of these e5 moves where they've just given up a pawn. They haven't played any kind of odd opening moves. I think this opponent's played very logically so far at this point. Now, in this position here, I have talked about in the past certain criteria, you could say, which will help us to decide what we do with our light square bishop. So one of the criteria I've talked about in the past in terms of how we develop our light square bishop is if they have the knight on the c6 square, we are more likely to push the e-pawn up to e3 and then try to play the move bishop b5 and pin the knight. In this particular case so far, that's not on the board. Black hasn't played knight to c6. So if that's not the case, they also haven't played the move pawn to c5. This is also a move that sometimes is a little bit of a criteria. This is another version of the criteria that will help us to determine maybe we should put the bishop on the b5 square and give a check. What we don't really want to do here, I would say, is we don't really need to play the move e3 in this particular situation, because if our bishop ends up on the b5 square, black could just push the pawn to c6. Like if we go e3 and they go e6, we're not going to play bishop to b5 because they'll block with the c-pawn. So if we're not going to put the bishop on b5, without them having developed the knight or pushed the c-pawn up the board, then there's really not a lot of purpose in developing, in making the move pawn to e3 in the first place. Because if we're not going to put the bishop on b5, the other option would go to e2, and e2 just feels a bit more passive. So we're going to go for the move g3 and put the bishop on g2 instead. And this is going to be a bit more of a active location for our bishop to move to. It's going to be able to put a little bit of pressure on black's center and different things like that. So our opponent plays the move queen to d6, which is a bit of an odd move. I think they might be supporting some e5 ideas at the right time, but it's usually a little bit awkward to use the queen to do that job. I think it would be better for them to play e6 and put the bishop on d6, and that bishop can help them to play the move pawn to e5 at some point. But the queen is kind of in the way of the bishop and a little bit misplaced, I would say. So I'm just going to continue with bishop to g2. Black plays the move knight to d7, and now they do have a potential idea of playing pawn to e5. Now, as we've talked about in other games in the Speedrun series, usually if the opponent is threatening or has the idea of playing pawn to e5, we usually want to play a move like pawn to d4 to stop them from doing that. Now, because our bishop is already on b2, I'm a little bit less in a rush to play the move d4 because the bishop would be blocked in. There are definitely some scenarios we have seen throughout the series where I am still playing the move d4 if the opponent is about to play e5, even though I have a bishop on b2. I think in this particular situation, I'm going to hold off on it. And what I'm going to do instead here is I'm probably going to lean towards the move pawn to c4 instead. Pawn to c4 is another way of kind of working around our opponent's idea of playing e5. Because if we play the move pawn to c4 and they play e5, we can at least eliminate one of their two central pawns. Now, against the move pawn to c4, probably black's best move is to play pawn to c6. If they do that, then I may play d4, quite honestly. I don't want to just completely let them have the center with zero fight. But I'm going to play the move pawn to c4 first and see what they do in response. So I would kind of go for c4, then d4, rather than the other way around. It is fine to go d4 first if you want to. I think playing d4 in this position would have been totally fine. But I like the idea of putting a little bit of pressure on the opponent's central pawn first before resorting to the d4 move. Okay, so they castle. The downside of castling here, in my opinion, is that once we do make this trade of pawns, they're going to have to recapture with one of their pieces. And once they capture with a piece, they are having one less central pawn in the middle of the board. This is usually a thing that's good for us. We did see this in the in one of the previous games where the opponent played the Jagoran defense. They allowed us to take the d5 pawn. They had to recapture with the piece, and then they kind of got overrun in the center of the board very quickly. Now, it's a little bit different here, We're not able to play e4, for example, because black would take that pawn. But there are some little, ideas that we can work with in this position. One example is we might even be able to play a move like knight to g5, targeting the pawn on f7, and then e4 afterwards is maybe an idea. We could also go pawn to d3 with the idea of playing e4 afterwards. That's also very much an idea. I think with all that being said, what I'm going to do here, even knight to d4, hit the bishop, and then knight to b5. This is actually another interesting idea. We are behind on development a fair amount. At least at the moment, we have 3 pieces to our opponent's 3, and they're castled, and the queen is in the game. So it's always a little bit risky sometimes to go trying to do a bunch of dynamic play with when you're kind of behind on development. So I think for that purpose, I'm just going to castle first, and let's see what our opponent does in response. Maybe they should go ahead and make that e5 move. But if they do that, I might go for d4, and I'm going to try to blast open the center of the board. My bishops are on good diagonals. This bishop aims towards the opponent's king a little bit. This bishop aims towards the rook, so the pawn on g7 would be kind of pinned. So they do play the move e5, understandably. I think I'm leaning towards the move d4. I don't know if I want to do it immediately or if I want to do something else first. If I go d4, the only thing I'm slightly worried about is them playing e4, which is a little bit annoying because then they kind of shut down my bishop and hit my knight and stuff like that. Also, if they play e4, my bishop on b2 looks a little silly. So I think I'm actually going to go for the move d3. I'm threatening to play the move e4. They need to do something about this. Maybe they should, retreat the bishop or move the knight backwards to avoid the fork. But then what I'm going to do after that, assuming that they stop my fork, which in this case they didn't stop. If they had retreated the bishop, I was going to play the move knight to d2 and try to maneuver the knight forward to attack the queen as well as the pawn in the center. So in this case, though, they did stop me from playing the move e4. I am going to go ahead and play e4 to make the fork. And this is one of the problems that, maybe not problems, but this is one of the things that people, that opponents who develop their bishop to the f5 square early in the game, this is something that they always have to be on the lookout for, this d3 followed by e4 advance, because it attacks the bishop, and a lot of times it'll also attack a pawn on d5, or in this case, a knight on d5. So they move the bishop away. We take the knight, of course. If they recapture with their queen, I will probably move my knight. Okay, they played pawn to e4, so I'm going to take this pawn. Even though this knight is pinned, I can eliminate this pawn that's attacking my knight. They take back with the rook. Here I'm going to go for the move knight to c3, just developing and attacking the rook here. The rook will have to move away somewhere. And then wherever the rook moves, assuming it goes backwards, maybe then I'll go queen to d4 in the center of the board. That will get away from the pin and also attack the pawn and bishop simultaneously, assuming that the rook retreats. If he doesn't retreat the rook, then of course I'll take the rook. Yeah, it's already a bad position for black because they're simply down. They're just down a full piece. They got forked. They lost the knight. They aren't even up a pawn in return for it. They've simply lost a lot of material. So they retreat the rook to e7, which is a very weird location because it blocks in the bishop on f8. So that square doesn't really make any sense. I'm going to go ahead and go queen to d4. Attack the bishop, attack the pawn. I think a move like knight to b5 would have also been pretty good to hit the queen and the pawn. They advance. They do stop me from taking the pawn, but they don't deal with the bishop. The bishop on g4 was unprotected, so I can take that piece. And yeah, now we're just up 2 pieces with a big advantage. Black is really just falling for kind of unsafe moves. They're not defending the bishop. They walked into a fork. Here's another example of a tactic. They push the pawn. This is always something that we are on the lookout for in the Reti Nimzo Larsen. Our bishop on b2 is always lurking and aiming towards the opponent's rook on h8. If they open up the diagonal, we can move the knight out of the way in this case, hit the queen, hit the rook. There's no way they can save both pieces at the same time. The queen is the more important piece, so they should move the queen, and then we'll take the rook and be ahead even more material, which is great for us. So they take the pawn in the center. I'm just going to take the rook. Maybe there's other moves that are also good. I can also take the pawn. I can move the rook in the center and hit the queen. There's discovered attacks. It's a pretty bad position for black. They're just down way too much material. So they play f5, they attack the queen. I'm going to move the queen over to a square where it's protected. And I'm also very happy to trade queens. Queen to f4 would have also been a pretty good move, threatening checkmate. But okay, we're up a ton of material here. Queen trade would be great. There's really no good way to avoid the queen trade either. The only square they can move to that's safe would be c6. And then there I will take the pawn on a7, forking black's pieces there. So let's trade the queens. I can take the pawn on a7 if I want to. I'm first going to attack the knight in the center of the board with a new development with my rook coming into the game. And let's see what black does. We can also check on d6 at the right time. We can play rook e1 to trade off their rook at the right time. I might as well take the pawn. I don't really see why not. Let's move the knight back to safety. Now rook to d8 check is a big threat. Hit the king, hit the bishop. It's not checkmate just yet because the knight would be able to block, but it's pretty close to checkmate. So they push the pawn. This doesn't really deal with the threat. I can check on d8. They have to block with the knight. It's the only move. And then I can, of course, take the bishop. I can also bring my bishop in and deliver a check as well. Tons of moves win. As long as you're just capturing more stuff and winning more material, you're going to be in pretty good shape in a position like this. So there's really no counterplay for the opponent. There's no back rank problems because I always have the bishop that can block checks, and even if the bishop wasn't here, the g2 square would be available. And yeah, we're just up a ton of material, and we're in good shape here. Okay, so let's go back and analyze this game. We're playing the move knight f3, d5, b3, knight f6, and black plays pretty solidly so far. This is definitely one of the more solid approaches that we've had an opponent play against our Reti Nimzo Larsen so far. But the queen d6 move was a little bit odd, in my opinion. A much more solid way of playing would be something like e6, bishop g2, they develop, we castle, they castle, and we usually will go with a setup like this, where we go knight to d2, pawn to c4, play on the queen side a little bit more, and yeah, it's a position that's perfectly fine for both players. We'll probably see some examples of this as the speedrun continues, because this is one of the more solid ways that black can play. Queen to d6, though, is a bit odd. They developed the knight to d7. I like this c4 move. I think playing d4 would have also been totally fine as well, but I like the idea of chipping away at the center of the board first. And I think that black's best move is probably just to play pawn to c6 here. It's usually very important if you have a c4 versus d5 pawn kind of tension, you could say. If you're potentially looking to take your opponent's central pawn with a non-central pawn of your own, and they would have to recapture with a piece, it's usually not a great situation for them to be in. It's a lot better for them to defend the central pawn with another one of their own pawns so that they can recapture with the pawn in the center. Or if they don't want to do that, they might just go ahead and trade the pawns on c4 and then play e5. I think this would have also been a relatively fine way of playing as well. But they castled, which allowed us to take the pawn and then castle ourselves. And now the big issue is that black has these pieces that are they're all in the center of the board and they look good, but they're all kind of targets at the same time. We saw in the game how the move d3 then e4 showed that these two pieces were kind of in forking distance of a pawn. And even if they had defended against that, let's say in this position they retreated the bishop, even if they had defended against that, I might have moved the knight to d2, and now you have to worry about knight to c4, and this queen is on a kind of awkward square. You probably are going to have to move it again. Maybe they play f6, hit the queen. Black has to be careful about where they move the queen away to. If they move the queen to e7, this knight's undefended. You have to always be on the lookout for these ideas. So this would have been maybe better than losing the piece, of course, as they did in the game, but it's still a position that white's in pretty good shape with. In the game, black did not move either one of the pieces. We went for the fork. We won the material. And yeah, we were simply up a full piece at this point. We make additional threats. attacking the bishop as well as the pawn. Very important when you have a winning position with a big material advantage, or really any kind of material advantage. You don't want to just you do want to play it safe in some regards. You don't want to give your opponent too much counterplay, but that also doesn't mean that you want to just play lackadaisically and have no idea or plan behind your moves. You still want to try to play aggressively, keep the foot on the gas pedal. It might sound a bit like I'm kind of giving advice on both ends of the spectrum, like, oh, you should play safe in positions where you're ahead and take away the counterplay, but you should also be aggressive and kind of attack the opponent and make threats. Both can be true at the same time, is really just the way it works out. So here we're making threats and being aggressive. Our opponent ends up missing that their bishop was hanging. We also won the rook in the corner, and yeah, the game was pretty much over at that point. We end up getting the win here when our opponent gets checked on the back rank. It's not checkmate. They could block with the knight, but probably here I would check with the bishop. If they move the king away, then this is checkmate. And if they take the bishop, then I'll take back. And checking on d7, taking the knight, this is pretty much game over here as well. So anyways, though, that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, so we've got our third game with our Reti Nimzo Larsen here. We're against M9G Burr, rated 1177. So we go knight f3, they go for d5. We go for b3. And our previous opponent played pretty solidly in the opening phase. This opponent plays the move knight to c6 on move number 2, which is a very common move. We've definitely seen this in the speedrun series so far. They want to play the move pawn to e5, and so we're playing bishop to b2 in order to discourage this move. Now we'll see what our opponent does in response. Okay, our opponent goes for the move f6. So as I mentioned in the previous game, and as I've mentioned in plenty of the other games as well, when our opponent is threatening to play the move pawn to e5, we usually want to do something about that in terms of preventing it from happening, or at least if they were to play it, we get something else in return for it. Now, in the previous game, I was holding off on the move d4 for one moment. I did not play d4 right when our opponent kind of had the setup going to play the move e5. I instead had played the move c4 in that previous game. Now, I'll point out here that c4 is not as good as it was in the previous game, because if we go for c4 here, black does have the ability to push the pawn up to d4, and they kind of cross into our half of the board. They shut down the bishop on b2, and they still have the idea of playing e5 next move to still get that big space advantage. If we go c4 and they go d4, we could try the move e3 to chip away at the pawn, but then they're still going to play e5 to support the pawn, and our bishop on b2 is going to have a hard time seeing the light of day. And when the pawn is on d4, it also stops our knight from getting to the c3 square that easily. So here I'm not going to go for the c4 move. I'm going to go for the d4 move instead. So we do stop black from playing e5, at least on this current move. And we, as we've seen in other episodes, the downside of the pawn being on the f6 square is that it really restricts the kingside knight from developing to the square that it really wants to go to. Okay, so this opponent goes for queen d6. So this is not the same opponent as the previous game, a completely different guy, but kind of a similar setup. We're seeing the queen coming to d6. He really wants to play the move e5, it looks like. And we were preventing it a moment ago. Now it is a move that's on their radar. And I think in this particular circumstance, I am now looking at playing c4 because now they can't push the pawn up to the d4 square. Another possibility is just letting them play e5. We could play something like e3, and if they do play e5, we trade the pawns and then play the move bishop to b5 in order to pin that knight. That's also another potential idea as well. In this particular case, I'm leaning a little bit more towards that idea. If I go for c4 right away, the one thing I'm a little bit concerned about is maybe they can take the pawn. And if I do recapture, this move queen to b4 check is a little bit annoying because they attack my bishop, they attack my king, and they also attack my pawn on c4. And I don't really have a way to defend all three of those things simultaneously. The bishop is obviously, well, you have to block the check, of course, but the bishop is obviously more important than the pawn, and I would have to lose the c4 pawn rather than lose the bishop. So I think here I'm going to go for the e3 move, and if they do play e5, I'm going to be able to use the ability to put the bishop on the b5 square to pin the knight at the right time. So I'm going to go e3. They're probably going to go e5. I assume that was their whole idea behind playing queen d6 in the first place. And if they do play e5, I am probably going to trade the pawns and then make the pin. That's my idea. So they play knight h6. So what do I know? I thought the idea for them was to play e5, but I guess they're not going for it, at least not yet. Now that I have moved the e-pawn, I do open up the bishop. I am not in a rush to pin right now, because if they kick my bishop and I take the knight, they can avoid the doubled pawn situation, which is usually what we're going for if we go for the bishop pin. A lot of times also when we go for the bishop pin and eliminate the knight, we're trying to follow up with a move like our own knight jumping into e5 when their knight on c6 is gone. That's also not really a possibility here when they have the pawn on f6. So what I am going to do, though, is I'm going to revert back to the c4 idea, because when I played the move e3, it opened up my bishop to guard the c4 square. So I'm going to go for c4 here. It's also generally good to try to open up the position when your opponent's playing kind of odd-looking moves in the opening phase. Like knight h6 especially is a bit of a weird one to me. Queen d6 was a little bit odd. So c4, the idea is just to trade pawns, open up the position, and really just try to get at my opponent. I'm going to try to castle before they can, and I'm going to try to attack them before they can deal with it. So now they play the move e5, which this is definitely in a worse circumstance than it was previously, I will say that. So the problem now with playing e5 is that I can still make the trade in the center. I can't make the bishop pin on b5 anymore in this case because our pawn on c4 is blocking. But once I trade this pair of pawns, then I do have two pieces, two units, you could say. I have a pawn and a queen on d1, attacking the pawn on d5. I can take the pawn, and I'm just going to be up a pawn in that position. So it's very risky for our opponent to open the center of the board when we're kind of more equipped to deal with it. Not because we're better developed necessarily. I mean, technically he has two pieces and a queen developed. Technically he's actually ahead on development here. But the real issue is that our pieces are better placed to deal with the middle of the board opening up. The knight on h6 is not helping out in the center of the board. This knight is not really benefiting by the center of the board opening up. That's for sure. So they take with the knight. I'm going to go ahead and trade a pair of pieces. Let's trade the pair of knights here. They're going to take back, I would assume. And then I can take the pawn on d5. I can either take with the pawn or I can take with the queen. Probably both are good, quite honestly. I'm leaning towards taking with the pawn a little bit more because I still feel like the queen on d6 is on a bit of a suspicious square. I will point out real quick that queen h5 check attacking the king and the pawn, he'll just block with the knight, and the knight also guards the e5 pawn, so that doesn't really do a whole lot special for me. So I think I'm going to take with the pawn here. And then I'm going to just try to develop my bishop and castle pretty quickly. And I'm just up a pawn. I'm up a pawn. He's not castled. He's not fully developed. He also has an isolated e5 pawn, so that's a little bit of a detriment in his position at the same time. So now the question is, do I play bishop b5 check, or do I do something like bishop c4? I'm kind of leaning towards bishop b5 check, because if black blocks with the pawn, I can go ahead and take the pawn, and then I'll kind of be offering a potential trade of queens. And if the queens come off the board, being ahead material, that's going to be pretty good for me, I think. If he does not block with the pawn and he instead blocks with the bishop, I'm pretty happy to trade pieces when I'm ahead as well. So I'm going to make the check. If he moves the king, I'll probably just castle at that point. So if you move the king, I'm castling. If you block with the pawn, I'm taking. I was going to just say real quick, if he blocks with the pawn and then tries some kind of queen to b4 check, attacking my king and my bishop, knight to c3 is a pretty typical way of like blocking the check and guarding the bishop in that situation. So he blocked with the bishop. I'm going to just trade pieces. Let's just trade. If the queen takes back, then I might consider picking up the pawn on e5 in the center of the board. And if the king takes, I'll probably just castle. Okay, so he does take with the queen. It is fully possible for me to take this pawn on e5. The only thing that could be a little bit bothersome is if they check with the bishop on b4, but even there I guess I can just bring my bishop back to block the check, or I can block with the knight. So I think I can get away with just grabbing this pawn here. Yeah, I'll just go for this. I don't think there's any repercussion. And then I'll castle my king next move. and I'll just be up 2 pawns. Okay, they end up castling. They are attacking the pawn on d5. I could play knight c3 to guard the pawn, but quite honestly, then my bishop on e5 feels a little bit misplaced. It feels like it's kind of hanging out in thin air a little bit. That being said, even if they attack it, I can always put it back on d4, so maybe it's fine to do that. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. I'm going to be slightly greedy here, mainly because I know if this bishop is hit, I can move it back to d4, and I'm in a pretty safe situation there. So next move, we are definitely going to castle if our bishop is not hit. If he plays like knight f7 or rook e8 and hits the bishop, then we have to guard the bishop. But here I'm going to go ahead and castle the king. I'm not worried about the knight since it is defended, so let's go ahead and castle. And if he does attack my bishop, I'll just bring it back to d4, or I might even bring the queen up to d4 and attack his bishop and different things like that. It is possible for black to take the knight and then win the pawn in the center, but he would also be giving up the protection of the g7 pawn in the process. So he plays rook e8. He is attacking the bishop. Do I go queen to d4 or bishop to d4? That is kind of the question to figure out here. Queen to d4 is definitely more active because we attack the bishop in the process. So I'm leaning towards that option. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for that. The only move that's a little bothersome is queen e7, guarding the bishop and hitting mine. But even there, worst case scenario, I just bring my bishop back to safety, the other diagonal. So yeah, I'm going to go queen d4, hit their bishop, guard mine. It's a bit more of an active move compared to playing bishop back to d4, which I think would have also been a totally fine move to play. But by keeping by centralizing the queen, we guard the bishop and we attack theirs at the same time. We're also even attacking the pawn on a7. So there's even ideas of taking the pawn and then checking on a8 and stuff like that. So black plays knight f5, they attack my queen, but they didn't really defend the bishop. So the question here, though, is do I take the bishop or do I take the pawn? If I take the pawn, I am threatening checkmate, which is tricky for black to deal with. If I take the bishop, they'll take mine, and I'm still up 2 pawns. If I take the pawn, they'll move the queen and give their king an escape square, probably. And then it's kind of like a lot of stuff is floating in midair. I'm just going to go for the safer option here, quite honestly, especially because I'm kind of behind on time. I'm just going to take the bishop. He should take my bishop, I would assume, is what he is going to do. And then I'm just going to get the rooks into the game. I have 2 extra pawns. No need to do anything super fancy here. No need to go crazy. I really just have to consolidate my position. I'm going to get the rook in the game. I'm not worried about the pawn since it's defended. And I'll probably play a move like pawn to e4 pretty soon as well, just to reinforce the d5 pawn. And, okay, I have about a minute and a half on the clock left, but we are up 2 pawns with a very nice position. Just have to play a little bit quicker, and we should get the win as the game goes on. So from here, I am now threatening moves like knight to b5, attacking the pawn on c7, and I would also be attacking the pawn on a7 at the same time. So, okay, knight to d6 is a reasonable move. It does stop my knight from advancing forward. I think I'm going to go for the move, probably e4 here. I could also just double up the rooks on the c file. Maybe that's a little simpler. I'm going to go for rook to c2, rook to c1, move the knight, try to go after the c7 pawn. Now that I'm looking at it, queen to d4 is also pretty good. Hit the rook and hit the pawn. That would have probably been an even better move than rook to c2. Because we're forking 2 undefended pieces simultaneously. So if he doesn't stop that idea, I'll go back for it. But objectively, that would have been probably a bit stronger of a move. But okay, rook to c2, we're still up 2 pawns, life is good. Not an easy position for black to navigate here whatsoever. Okay, knight to b5. So this is not a safe move. I'm attacking the knight 2 different times. It is only defended 1 time. I could take with the queen. I can take with the knight. I'm going to take with the knight because I want to open up the threats of capturing the c7 pawn and the a7 pawn simultaneously. And it's really not a good way to guard both. There's really not even a good way to guard c7 in the first place. If you play pawn to c6, I will probably just trade the pawns, or I'll take on a7 first and then take on c6 if they push forward. Alternatively, rook takes c7, forking the queen and the king is a very big threat here in this position. So we're up a piece. We're up 2 pawns. Knight to b5 clearly was a big mistake from our opponent, but they were already in a rough position before that. Okay, they go king to b8. I could take on c7, but then they're going to take on d5, and probably that's still winning for me. But I think I see an even better option. I like this move queen to d4 still. I'm threatening queen takes a7. I'm threatening the rook. If he takes the knight, I'll take the rook. And there's not a good way to deal with both of those attacks at the same time. So I'd already mentioned that I had this queen to d4 move a moment ago. Here it's an even better version of things because now this comes with a check. The king has to move, and then queen to a8 is going to be checkmate. Excuse me, in this position here. So pretty much we win this game with like little tactics along the way. We pick up a pawn in the center. We pick up a second pawn. Our opponent gave away the knight, but then we have this queen d4 move to win more material, and we get the win in this position. So let's go back and analyze the game. Knight f3, d5. Our opponent plays a pretty solid setup. It is a little bit risky to play a move like f6, but quite honestly, it's definitely a playable way to do things. I do think the queen d6 approach that both of these recent opponents have played in the last 2 games on this episode, both of them had the queen on d6 at some point. I do think the queen on d6 is kind of a risky move because the queen is easier to attack on this square. I think once again black should probably play something like bishop f5. I think I would go for e3 with the idea to pin. Maybe they stop the pin, or maybe they go something like e6. I pin, they develop, they defend, and the game goes like this. White's, I think, a little bit better because I don't really think that this configuration of things on the king side is that great. But it's a solid position nonetheless, and black is not down material or getting themselves into big trouble. So the queen d6 move, and then at knight h6, like these moves were both a bit odd to me. I did talk about during the game that how I was thinking about the move c4. I was kind of concerned about this idea, but probably this is not that big of a problem. I could block with the bishop, and then probably do some kind of d5, e4. Like this starts to become a big problem for the opponent. We're down a pawn, but we're going to get this big center. We're going to attack the queen. I think this is a very viable way of playing, but I decided to not sacrifice material. I just decided to go for e3 first, then c4, and then it was black who started losing material. We took in the center 2 times, and then took the d5 pawn. I think taking with the queen was also totally fine too. But I took with the pawn, checked, traded, took another pawn, defended. It was possible for black to trade on c3 and then take on d5, but I would have traded the queens and then taken the pawn on g7 that's no longer protected, and black would have been in big trouble here as well. So they hit the bishop, I counterattacked, they lost the bishop, then here we were just up 2 pawns, they also lost the knight, and the game was pretty much decided after that. So anyways, though, that is going to be our 3rd game of this particular episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed the couple of games we've taken a look at here. I will be back in the next video or episode in this series with playing games against players in the rating range of 1200 to 1300, continuing to climb the ladder. So hopefully you'll have enjoyed this one, and hopefully you'll enjoy the next one. See you in the next video.